All right, great. Thanks to you all for coming out. I'm sorry, I don't have PowerPoint. Hasn't gotten to Canada yet. We just have Moose Point up there. So anyway, so the topic I'd like to address is whether moral relativism supports is a reason for tolerance. And I want to talk about the topic because I think it's of independent philosophical interest. I also think that the affirmative answer to the question is something that almost every person in the street believes. And that includes people who like relativism and tolerance, and it includes people who dislike relativism and dislike tolerance. But I think almost everybody seems to think there's a connection. And so my answer to the question is going to be, there's a bit of truth in what they're saying, but there's a bit of truth in the negative answer too. So I hope that's not entirely unsatisfying. So before I try to answer the question, and before I sort of try to say why I think the question is interesting, I want to get clear on a couple of the key ideas. Right? So by relativism, I mean the view that fundamentally what makes actions right or wrong, permissible or impermissible, are the attitudes of cultures, societies, or communities. Now, there are about 1 million different types of relativism between which we could distinguish. So for example, there's a distinction drawn in the literature between what's sometimes called agent relativism and what's sometimes called speaker relativism. So, to get a feel for the distinction, imagine that Bob from one culture is looking at Lucy from another culture and saying, "Hey, Lucy, what you're doing is wrong." Right. According to speaker relativism, Bob's judgment is right just insofar as it accords with the attitudes of Bob's culture, that is, the speaker's culture. According to agent relativism, what makes Bob's judgment right is that it accords with the attitudes in Lucy's culture, the agent, the person whose action is being judged, her culture. Now, that distinction is not going to matter all that much for our purposes, but I thought I'd get it on the table. Now, there are two positions that I want to kind of distinguish from relativism. The first is nihilism. So the nihilist thinks that morality is not relative to cultures or societies because morality is just an illusion. Right? There's nothing that makes actions right or wrong, good or bad, because actions just aren't right or wrong, good or bad. Right? There are just no rules out there in this sort of domain. Now, people often confuse relativism with nihilism, but I think it's important to keep them distinct. Most importantly, though, I want to distinguish relativism from a position that I'm going to call realism. So realism is the view that what makes actions good or bad, right and wrong, fundamentally is something other than our attitudes. Now, realists will differ about what that something else is, but what distinguishes them from relativists is that they think it's not just my attitudes, your attitudes, our collective attitudes, whatever that means. Okay, so that's relativism. Now, by tolerance, I simply mean the set of practices that's sort of centered around letting other people do what they want, even if you don't want them to do what they're doing. Right? I mean, I know there's big literature on what exactly is tolerance. That's what I take to be sort of tolerance in a nutshell. So the question is, does relativism support that? So why should we care about this question, whether relativism supports tolerance? Well, I think there are a lot of reasons. So a couple of the obvious ones first. All right. First, you might care about the question because you yourself are sympathetic to relativism. Right? That's the view about the nature of morality that you find you find congenial. And you want to know whether, given the view that you accept, you should be tolerant, and, to some degree or other. Another reason that you might want to know about the answer to this question is because you find yourself attracted to the idea of tolerance, and you want to know whether or not you should be a moral relativist because you think, well, gosh, if tolerance is right and relativism serves as a good explanation of why tolerance is right, then maybe that's a reason to accept relativism. On the other side, you might be interested in the question because you hate tolerance, or at least you think tolerance is mistaken in a certain class of cases, which I think, anybody who's ever had a roommate, right, has had this thought at one time or another, right? Some things you just can't tolerate, Doritos. So you think tolerance is mistaken in some cases, and so you want to know whether you can accept relativism consistently with your thinking it's mistaken. There are a couple of other sort of more difficult to get at reasons why you might be interested in the question. So one of my, and I'll say it on camera, one of my philosophical heroes, Richard Rorty, thought that we shouldn't really be talking about the question of whether realism is right or relativism is right because it doesn't make any practical difference, right? What we should be doing is trying to make the world a better place, but this kind of philosophical muckety-muck about whether this obscure view about the nature of morality is right or this obscure view about whether the nature of morality is right is not one that it's worth our time or our money going about. Now, if there's in fact a connection between relativism and tolerance, right, then it seems that there is a practical upshot to this debate. Right? It matters to how we ought to behave which of these fancy-pants meta-ethical theories is true. And so Rorty would be wrong if there's a connection between relativism and tolerance. Now again, my answer to this question is going to be maybe there's a connection, maybe there's not, so it's not going to trouble Rorty so much. But I think that's an important sort of reason why it'd be worth addressing this question. Finally, I think it's worth addressing this question for, I guess, what you might call psychological reasons. Right? So in considering the question of whether relativism supports tolerance, I think we can discover sort of what our implicit values are. Right? So there are so many people out there who think there's just this obvious connection between relativism and tolerance. And I think it's worth sort of probing at this widespread attitude to see what lays behind it. Right? So there are certain philosophers who think that it's a central task in philosophy to try to uncover what's implicit, right, in our practices and make it explicit. And I'm one of those philosophers. So those are a bunch of reasons why you might care about the answer to this question. Okay, so what is the answer to this question? Well, let me start off by just kind of asserting something. And that's that both relativism and realism are consistent with both tolerance and intolerance. Right? So my claim is, so the question is not, can you be a relativist and be intolerant, or can you be a realist and be tolerant? So the answer to all those questions is yes. Right? So for example, you could be a realist, right? So you think there are certain objective values, but you think it's among those objective values that you ought to be tolerant. Or you could be a relativist and think that morality is at its root relative to the attitudes in different cultures, but think, hey, it follows from the attitudes of cultures that we ought not to tolerate this or that or the other thing. So I think that both of these views, realism and relativism, are consistent with both tolerance and intolerance. But I don't think that goes very far, because consistency is a kind of is very weak. So as a certain Edinburghian philosopher once observed, right, it's consistent with our present evidence, right, that the sun's not going to rise tomorrow. Right? That's true. It's consistent with that. So our question really is not about whether relativism is consistent with tolerance. It's about whether it supports it, whether in conjunction with certain plausible background principles, plus relativism, whether those together make it more plausible that we should be tolerant. So some philosophers think that the answer is no. And they think the answer is no because they think it's actually realism that supports tolerance. So here's why they think that. Because they think that if there are certain objective values, right, if there are certain things that are right and wrong, independently of my approval of them or disapproval of them, independently of the attitudes of my culture or my society, then I could very well be mistaken about what they are. Right? They're sort of out there independently of what I think. They're out there independently of what my friends think. I can't discover them by opinion polls. Right? So I might be wrong about what they are. But if there's a chance that I could be wrong about morality, then this gives me a reason to be humble. Right? Why should I refuse to tolerate others' behavior if that refusal is, if the only thing that could ground that refusal is certainty or close to certainty that my judgment is right? But if I think my judgment might be wrong, that gives me a reason to be more tolerant. This is a view that some philosophers give. I think there's a lot going for this view. So I think it's basically, right. Now there are certain complications. There are certain forms of relativism that are more sophisticated that can maybe escape this view. But I think the view has a lot going for it. So you should be tolerant because there's some chance that you might be wrong. All right, so with that said, is there anything on the other side? Is there a reason to think that it's not realism, but rather relativism supports tolerance? And I think the answer to this question is yes as well. So go back to our case involving Bob and Lucy, right? So Bob is over here in one culture. He's looking at Lucy and saying, hey, Lucy, what you're doing is wrong. And imagine Lucy is over in this other culture and she says something different. She says, no, I think that what I'm doing is right. Well, if relativism is true, then both of their statements could be correct. Okay? So it could be that despite the fact that Bob is not mistaken in his judgment, it could also be that Lucy is not mistaken in her judgment. But I think there's a certain kind of connection between tolerance and basically mistakes. So it's something that I want to call the mistake principle. And the principle is that you're wronging somebody insofar as you prevent that person from doing what she wants, unless her behavior is based on some sort of mistake or some sort of irrationality. So I think this principle kind of plays itself out in a lot of different contexts. One is the debate about paternalistic laws. So laws that say, we're going to forbid you from doing something even though that's something that you would like to do, and we're going to forbid you from doing it, as it were, for your sake. Now, I think in sort of Western liberal democracies, we tend to look down on paternalistic laws and think they're sort of silly. But I think we do make some exceptions when we think that the people being governed by paternalistic laws are acting as they do because they're making some sort of mistake. Right? So a famous example of this is from John Stuart Mill. He thought, look, even though he was an opponent of generally an opponent of paternalism, he thought that if somebody was about to drive over a chasm, not knowing that a bridge was out, it would be okay if you couldn't warn that person to stop that person from driving over the chasm, right? Because that person's action would be based on a mistake. So I think there's a connection between mistakes and sort of letting other people do what they want. So basically, again, the mistake principle says that you're wronging somebody insofar as you're stopping them from doing what they want, unless that person is making some sort of mistake. And in our Bob and Lucy case, if relativism is true, it doesn't seem like Lucy is making a mistake. It seems that she's just as mistake-free as Bob is. Now, here's where you might respond, but look, there's a crucial difference between cases of paternalistic laws and a lot of the cases we're concerned about when we talk about relativism. Because suppose that Lucy's action is not, purely self-affecting. Suppose her action is not driving over a chasm or taking drugs or selling herself into slavery, is another popular example. Suppose her action is attacking Bob. Then surely Bob isn't wronging Lucy by stopping her from doing what she wants, whether or not she's making a mistake. So that's a very plausible response to this kind of mistake principle. But I think that response is ultimately mistaken. So to see why, I want to make one final distinction. And that's the distinction between doing the wrong thing and wronging somebody. And I want to claim that it's possible to wrong somebody despite not doing the wrong thing. So here's an example. Suppose that I'm being chased by gangsters, and the only way for me to get away from these gangsters is, to drive over Bob's newly planted begonias. Right? So I drive over his and I ruin his begonias. Now it seems like overall I've done perfectly permissible thing, right? My life versus Bob's begonias. They're really not great begonias, right? So it seems like I've done overall something that's okay to do. All the same, it seems like there's a certain sense in which I've done Bob a wrong, right? So I ought to, for example, apologize to Bob. I ought to help pay for those begonias. When he comes to my door and says, hey, I'm glad you escaped, but could you, sort of help me out here? Could you, replace the begonias? If I say, no, that's life, just deal with it, it seems like I've treated him inappropriately. And so what I guess I want to say in the case about Bob and Lucy is, look, if Lucy is attacking Bob, right, and Bob has to use force to defend himself against Lucy, yeah, that's not letting her get what she wants. And you might think that overall he's doing something that's perfectly okay, and I agree. But I do think he's standing in a relationship to Lucy where he's wronging her if she's not in any way mistaken in her judgment that what she's doing is okay. So I guess the kind of concluding message is this. There's a way in which realism supports tolerance. And that's that if realism is true, then it's much more plausible that we ourselves could be wrong in our moral judgments. And I also think there's a way in which relativism supports tolerance. And that's that relativism makes it more plausible that even if we're right in our moral judgments, so might people be right in other cultures who have radically different moral views. And so which effect is stronger is going to be a sort of context-dependent question, sort of a context-dependent issue. And I hope we're all sort of interested in exploring it. So, thanks.
This production is brought to you by the University of Edinburgh.